Russia has an economic concern, and that economic concern is Saudi Arabia wanting more cut of the international oil and crude export market. Saudi Arabia and the rest of OPEC, these are, petroleum producing countries that have coalesced together so they could design some form of cohesive economic model or economic plan on how to manage international oil supply and prices, constraining supply when they want the price to go up, and loosening supply, as in letting more get the market once they want the prices to go down, right? And by working together, they can stop price wars and they can stop the competition that could harm their business and allow them to coordinate. Now, the plan was, ever since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, was to keep oil at about the OPEC line of about $70 per barrel, if I remember correctly. Or was it? No, it was $100 per barrel. Now, at $100 per barrel, someone could make quite a pretty penny off of oil sales. But the problem is that they were never able to get it to $100 per barrel. And there's been a lot of finger pointing over exactly why that is the case, that they haven't been able to budget that high. And one of the finger points that exists is the idea that certain countries are actually exporting more oil to market than they are publicly disclosing or agreed to. And when we talk about the Russians, not only are they exporting more than they agreed to, and when asked to stop, they have not, and then they continue to do it again and again, year after year, and suggest through their public declarations of how much they want to export going off into the future, have not really shown any capacity to change that could keep oil prices lower than what they wanted. Not only that, there's other things as well, but this is just one example that is relevant to the article in question. And now the Saudis, after dealing with this for years and being frustrated at the fact that they haven't been able to get the oil prices up, because the thing is, if you're dealing with if you're constraining your supply of oil to the market under the hopes that the price will rise, the idea is that even though you're selling less, the less you're selling costs more, and therefore it balances out. Or maybe you're even making more money than you would have if you flooded the market with your product. Now, if an individual country was to flood the market with their product and everybody else constrained, then they would actually thrive. But the problem is that's not fair, and the other countries aren't going to play ball with that, and that's why they coordinate as a group. But the problem is they haven't been coordinating that tightly. And then when you add Russia's shadow fleet of tankers that are illegally transporting oil into the mix, it just makes the picture more murky. And this frustration has piled up and piled up and piled up. And now the crown prince and the crown prince, the butcher, the guy who chops up journalists, he says, you know what? He hasn't said this publicly, but the rumors are circulating. Maybe we'll just take a big slice of the oil market. See, the United States is massively expanding its exports of not only of liquefied natural gas, but of general energy products, to the point where the Biden administration had to put a pause on the construction of new liquefied natural gas LNG export terminals, because it's getting to a point where it might actually, under his suspicion, lead to an increase in domestic prices because we're exporting too much to other markets that want to buy it, primarily Europe. So America's getting a big slice of the pie. And if the Saudis cannot make up the money by getting to $100 per barrel, they have to find a new way to get a big slice of the pie, because the Saudi economy is largely, if not almost entirely, dependent on the oil and natural gas markets. As I believe the country with the most oil out of any country in the world. It was either them or Venezuela, I forget, but it's definitely one of the top three. Let me read you this Political article to give you a better insight. Moscow will be starved of funds to run its war economy if Saudi Arabia delivers on plans to hike crude production, protect its own position as global oil kingpin. Riyadh is capital of Saudi Arabia, is increasingly frustrated with the other petrostates' failure to coordinate on cutting supply rates of oil to about $100 per barrel, up from the current $70. I checked this morning, I think it's at 73 this morning, but general area. Oil traders say Saudi Arabia is now set to respond by flexing its muscles and turning the tables on the smaller producers, exporting more oil itself to grab market share and profits even as prices fall. The idea is, well, if you're selling, and I'm going to simplify it, 2 barrels of oil for $70, it's more than you would get if it was $60 and you exported more. But if you export 5 barrels at $60, you're making more money. The strategy could sink oil prices and spell bad news for Russian President Vladimir Putin. Oil and gas have been the largest single source of revenue for the Russian state over the past decade, making up as much as half of the country's budget. And now that Gazprom is at a net loss, I think one of the last things they need is for the sales they're making to go down in price value, when they're already giving massive discounts to both the Chinese and the Indians in order to keep their purchasers, in order to keep those consumers once they lost the European market. The problem with Russia today, and people call it a gas station with an arsenal of world-ending weapons, and I don't think that's entirely true. Russia, of course, has its own industry, it has its art and all the other stuff that it has. But when we talk about sheer size of GDP and where their value's coming from, where their money's coming from, where the money's being made, there is no competitor hands down. And if there's no competitor hands down, and it's where they're getting the majority of their budget from, and now the next 2025 budget is going to be something between 35 to 40% of their budget being spent on the armed forces. If that revenue decreases even more due to this increase of production by the Saudis and flooding the market with more of their product to increase market share, increase profitability, but then bring down the prices of their compatriots, that is going to hurt the Russians. That is going to hurt the Russians substantially. Now, maybe you could say to the Saudis that it was their fault for trusting the Russians in a pinch where if they feel like they cannot afford to not export that much, then they won't. You could say that, but it is what it is. A Russian energy analyst based in Norway said that Saudi Arabia's possible move posed an enormous risk for Moscow's state budget because of its overwhelming dependency on oil revenues, and it's just one of several unpredictable factors on the horizon, including the U.S. presidential election. So we have to sit back now and wait. Stock up on the popcorn, he said. Saudi Arabia understands perfectly well that Russian companies do not comply with the demand to reduce production, so they are making their own plans. Alexandra, an economist and fellow with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, agreed that the stakes were high for the Kremlin. At current exchange rates, a fall of $20 in oil prices would lead to a $1.8 trillion or $20 billion dollars. It was 1.8 trillion rubles, $20 billion fall in revenue. That's equivalent to about 1% of Russia's GDP. Pretty significant, a big 1% GDP drop. The government would face a choice of either reducing spending, unlikely during the war.
Arlander 2 has donated $5. My Prussian dog, my man. Let's restore the old Sweden too.
That felt like a curveball. Restore old Sweden. Okay, buddy. Thanks for $5. The government would face a choice of either reducing spending, unlikely during a war, or accepting inflationary pressure and stifling high interest rates. I mean, they could cut pensions. They could further cut education. They're already not increasing their infrastructure investments and their social programs to keep up with inflation. So that means Russians are already dealing with less just because of inflation. And global inflation has been a problem. If they were, at this point though, to cut pensions further, if they were to cut social services, if they were to further cut infrastructure investments, the Russian public has already been pushed pretty far when it comes to the war. So I think the Kremlin is going to be very hesitant to possibly cause another crisis. I mean, look what happened in Kazakhstan a few months before the war started. They tried to cut the amount of the amount of subsidies that Kazakhs were getting in order to be able to get low energy prices. Once they announced that cut, the whole country erupted. Soldiers were getting arrested by protesters on horseback. And it was only Russian soldiers being sent to put down dissent that ended up stabilizing the situation. It might be part of the reason why a lot of Kazakhs are a little bit more sympathetic towards the Ukrainians. Not to mention their shared history of Russian colonialism. So I think that if they were to do that, it would be a disaster. And so they'd have to find some other way to increase revenue when their budget is largely dependent upon the oil price and their export of oil. This is all on top of the fact that while this is all going on, the Ukrainians are still determined to target the refineries that could make these crude oil exports into more valuable products that they could then sell at a higher price. So while this is all going on, at the same time, they're being targeted by Ukrainian drones and attacks to try to undercut their production of more expensive products to sell. The global economy is fairly sluggish, and oil demand is not as high as the Saudis would want, said Palmer, a director of oil markets and analytics at the Commodities Intelligence from ICIS. Some producers, including Russia, are consistently exceeding their quotas. So that means prices are nowhere near the $100 per barrel, and the Saudis are losing patience. This would be one way for the Saudis to fire a warning shot to the market that they will act. The message is, you guys need to buck up, or you will all be earning less overall, because we will go for the market share over high price. And if there's one country in the world that has the capacity to do it, it's Saudi Arabia. Now, I don't know if the Russians are going to reel in their shadow fleet. I don't know if the Russians are going to reel in their exports, which they need, especially if they plan to expand the budget when it comes to military spending, which if they want to, win the war, they're going to have to do that. Then they can't really cut back on their shadow fleet that they've cultivated, trying to still get exports to countries illegally and trying to go around the $60 barrel price cap. And I'm saying illegally as in the countries agreed to the price cap and then they're now abiding by the price cap, etc. Point is, this is a potential crisis for the Russians. And while the Russian economy has many pillars right now that have been degraded, undercutting its financial base could be a disaster. Now, we're not going to see any immediate effects, even if this does come to pass and it is more than a rumor. It's going to take time for this to manifest, and it takes time for the Russians to run out of money. But this is a strong reminder that the Russians cannot do this indefinitely. All actions have an equal and opposite reaction. And invading another country for 2.5 to 3 years for grand dreams of imperial vision has an opposite reaction. You know what that is? A high bill and a lot of dead men. I also want to point out that due to the fear of an Israeli strike on Iranian oil export terminals and export infrastructure, after President Biden, when asked, would not count out the idea that the Israelis might target oil infrastructure, the Iranians have completely moved out all of their tankers from the area. This is what it looked like just like a week ago. You can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 tankers in this image. Now you can't count one. It's an empty anchorage. They seem to be nervous about it. I will say, though, while we've been talking about oil price decreases due to a surge of oil to the market by Saudi Arabia, the threat of a regional war, and now we can see with those tankers, has caused a fear of oil supply being strained, and it has caused a slight bump in oil prices. It's only a slight bump, and that's why we're not at $70, we're at $73, like I said earlier. And I think that's partially because they still think maybe a regional war could be avoided. And if a regional war does happen, that does not mean that Iranian oil export terminals are going to be targeted. And even if Iranian oil export terminals are targeted, there's still even a worse scenario where it's not just, oh, wow, they got targeted. Now we're going to see like a $5 a barrel increase, which is going to help the Russians. It's going to help a lot of other people. It's also an opportunity for the Russians to just target any oil suppliers in the entirety of the Gulf of Aden. And if that's the case, then we're talking about a $10 per barrel increase, which would be even larger. Let's listen to this BBC report.
Now, President Biden says Washington is discussing with Israel the possibility of Israeli strikes on Iran's oil infrastructure in response to Tehran's unprecedented missile attack this week. Now, it comes after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Tehran would pay a heavy price for its actions. Joe Biden's comments ended up sparking a surge in the price of crude oil, up by 5% at one point. Faisal Islam is here to explain a little bit more.
Thanks, Clive. In the aftermath of Iran's ballistic missile attack on Israel, and as we wait for news on Israel's response, there's already been a reaction in the world's oil market. The price of a barrel of crude oil shot up on international markets today. It was up 5% today, and that means since the attacks, it's up 10% to over $77 a barrel on the Brent crude measure. This is still down on the year because of global economic...
Am I out of date? Because the last thing I saw was 73. Maybe it came down since this. 1 second. Let me check my oil chart prices. No, yeah, Brent crude's at 77. I was wrong. I read WTI crude. My mistake. Sorry, a mistake all the youth are making these days, okay? You know, all the TikTok youth. Mixing up your WTI crude with your Brent crude. Rookie mistake.
Concerns, but the spike up today occurred immediately after President Biden added to suggestions that Israel would target Iran's oil facilities.
Would you support Israel striking Iran's oil facilities, sir?
We're in discussion with that. I think that would be a little... Anyway.
Now, the oil markets...
I think that would be a little anyway. I think he reeled himself in because it's a real possibility, but I think he doesn't want that. I think he might think he view that as escalatory, which, I mean, the impact it could have on the Iranian economy, it certainly could be escalatory. No, it would be escalatory, but then he stops himself. I don't know if that's just Biden being Biden or if that was like, let me stop myself because I don't want to commit to anything that's really likely.
It's reacted to that. Iran is the 7th biggest oil exporter in the world. Most of its exports go to China. The Israelis could choose
by the way, when they
target...
say most of their exports, they're kind of underselling it. 90% of their exports go to China.
The Iranian government's funding by hitting its oil export facilities on Karg Island or refineries crucial for making domestic petrol supplies. Some reported petrol queues already in Iran. These could disrupt but not necessarily upend global energy markets. If that happens, there's enough of surplus oil production in Saudi Arabia and the UAE to make up the difference. But would they? And then the big question in turn...
Here's the problem. You see this, the Strait of Hormuz? If the Iranians decided to just bomb any of the ships that were coming through here transporting oil, then they could shoot up oil prices even further.
Is what would be Tehran's response to any Israeli action. Much attention will then focus here on the Straits of Hormuz. 28 miles wide at its narrowest point between Iran and Oman. If Iran was to try to block it, then 20 million barrels per day, or a fifth of the world's oil production, not just Iran's, but every country in the Gulf, would not be able to transit their crude oil tankers. And these days it isn't just oil. The world's dependence on Russian gas has been replaced by shipments of liquefied gas, mainly from Qatar, also needing to transit.
Would that be good for Vladdy? Anything that increases oil prices right now is good for Putin.
That straight. So that's the nightmare scenario for energy prices and could be passed on in petrol and domestic energy costs, and all this at the moment when the world and households were emerging from that last energy shock. There's nothing certain about this, but with the US president now adding to the jitters, energy markets are now responding to heightened risks that could affect us all. Clive.
Faisal, thank you. Faisal.
Wow, oil news. We have truly become boomer television. Anyway, where were we? What are we going to cover next? Oh, I thought that this was pretty interesting. So Alex, again, follower of, I don't know if he's a follower of the channel, but he's a follower of me. He goes up there and he asked them about Ukraine and Georgia, and he covers the South Caucasus on the Hill, asking the Pentagon and the State Department, trying to hold them accountable on these, on these issues, trying to get them to answer the hard questions. He honestly, I think out of all of them, asked the questions that are the most relevant to our channel. So if there's a person to follow on the Hill, it is Alex. He questioned the State Department on their meeting with Zelensky over the victory plan, which we've heard very little about the reaction to it. And we got some word from them saying that they're going to engage with them on some things, and there's a number of quote-unquote productive steps. We don't know what those productive steps are. I would suspect it has to do with sanctions, because the Biden administration's already talked about like finding ways to ramp up sanctions, close up loopholes, maybe something to deal with the shadow fleet. That'd be good. We need progress on that. But I wanted to show you the State Department reaction. Oh, and for those of you who don't know, Vladimir Zelensky has gone around and made this victory plan that includes calls for more aid and other support to Ukraine in order to pursue either a very strong negotiating position with the Russians or just out-and-out victory. And they presented it to Biden, and the reaction was semi-mixed. We don't really know for sure, and a lot of it's just rumors, but point is we don't exactly know what they took positively, what they took negatively, etc. But it wasn't confetti cannons going off, that's for sure.
Alex said I'd come here and then we have to wrap in a few.
Thank you. A couple of questions on Ukraine. I want to start with the reports about the largest mass execution of Ukrainian POWs in Donetsk. Do you have any reaction? Ukraine started investigation.
So
they have murdered 16 of them.
So we have seen the reports. I don't have any independent information with which to confirm that. I think it's appropriate that Ukraine conduct the investigation that they've announced, but obviously speaking generally, we've seen Russia commit horrific acts since the beginning of this conflict.
On the victory plan that you guys have received last week, so about 1 week after that, did Ukraine have the Secretary's blessing to move forward to start implementing its victory plan?
So the victory plan that Ukraine presented is not just a question of actions that Ukraine would take. It's a question of actions that other countries around the world would take as well. Ukraine hasn't detailed that victory plan publicly yet, so I'm not going to do so from here. It's appropriate for them to do so. But we took that plan, we reviewed it, we saw a number of productive steps in it. We're going to engage with them about it.
They have been watching the Middle East last couple of days. They have been seeing that it's in fact possible to help non-NATO ally to shoot down missiles. I know, yeah, and I had this discussion last time, but Helsinki Commission called Ukraine's right to shoot back.
What was the?
Helsinki Commission called it the common sense. So to ease your restrictions, that's the common sense. Is that the opinion that you share?
So the U.S. Helsinki Commission recently came out and said that it was like common sense for the United States to ease restrictions on striking into Russia and hitting the locations that are striking into Ukraine. So that's a U.S. government agency endorsing the idea of loosening restrictions while the Biden administration keeps them in place.
So we have made clear that we support Ukraine's right to defend itself, not just in words, but in deeds, and we have provided them with the equipment they need to shoot down missiles. If you look at the air defense system...
Not enough. And I'm sorry, you've provided them some, but not enough. And that's, I mean, partially, of course, it's not like they don't have enough to go around to everyone, but that's because they haven't invested in the production capacity. Hell, to get the Stingers off the production lines, they had to call people out of retirement because they didn't have enough people who knew how to make Stingers. So, I mean, you could say to some extent, like, you know, it is what it is, but this probably just due to like a poor industrial base that was not ready for this type of war. I mean, it's building up slowly. We're quickly headed towards like 100,000 shells per month, which is much better than what it used to be. But when you're spending as much as we're spending on the armed forces, we should be ready to like drop a hat and produce shells.
That we have provided, including an air defense system that we announced, a new air defense system that we announced just last week. We've actually provided them with that capability, and we'll continue to provide them with that capability. Alex.
Okay, I just wanted to show that quickly. I thought it was interesting. But did this affect page? I was about to say, did this affect pager prices in the world? I don't really know that anybody even keeps track of that, the pager market.